So, hello everybody. Good morning to most of you, I guess. And for those of you joining us from elsewhere around the world, a good afternoon, or to some of you, maybe even a good evening. But to all of you, welcome back for day 3 of the 9th Americas Spectrum Management Conference.
Good morning to most of you, I guess.
Apologies for that. But anyways, as I was saying, welcome back for day 3 of the 9th Americas Spectrum Management Conference. So we've had 2 fantastic days so far with some great discussions taking place. And it's hard to believe it's kind of flying by us. It's hard to believe that we're almost halfway through the event already. And hopefully you've all been with us for the 2 days that we have had for Monday and Tuesday. But if you've missed any of the sessions that have taken place, or if you would like to catch up again on any of the sessions or the showcases or the Have Your Say session, which took place yesterday, then the recordings from all of the sessions are now available for you to watch again. You should have received an email, I think, after the end of the proceedings yesterday with links to be able to enable you to download those. You can also find a link to all of the sessions that have taken place so far on the reception page of the conference platform. So please do check that out if you wanted to go back and watch again any of the sessions that have taken place so far. I also just wanted to take a second before we start today to say a big thank you to everyone out there who has been contributing to the discussions in the event so far. So in addition to the main discussions that have been happening here on the conference stage, the debate and conversation has been happening alongside that in the chat area. And thank you to all of you who have been posting in that chat area. And also yesterday via our Have Your Say session, where a number of you came up and brought your audio and video feed live up onto the screen and had your say on the stage firsthand. So thank you all for that. We'll be running a Have Your Say session again later today. So if anybody out there wants to come up and to make comments or to give any of the key takeaways that you've had from the discussion so far, there will be an opportunity to do that later on today. And also, of course, to mention again, we do have the chat room running just to the right-hand side of your screen. So you can put your comments and questions for the speakers there. They will be passed to our panelists, and our panelists will be addressing those questions that are raised during the sessions via that chat function. And we also have an audience poll running again. So for this session and for all of the sessions running, we will be having polls to get your thoughts on some of the key issues. So if you check out the polls tab on the right-hand side, you can see the question that we have live and vote on that in preparation for the session we're going to be having running very shortly. So let's go on to talk about today's proceedings. So again, we have a busy day ahead of us. So if we have a look at what's taking place, so we're going to be starting very shortly with our first plenary session for the day, a session that's going to be looking at rural connectivity and connectivity in tribal areas. So looking at that, and it was an issue that was covered in a few of the sessions yesterday and in the Have Your Say session yesterday. So looking forward to having a session focusing just on that key issue. And I'll be introducing Stefan Sloan, who's been moderating that session very shortly. Following that, at 10:30 Washington, D.C. local time, we have the second set of our showcase sessions. So we have 2 showcase sessions running today. On showcase stage 1, we have a showcase being hosted by LYA, which is going to be looking at the US CBRS auction and looking at a perspective on the value of shared licenses in a prime 5G band. And then on showcase stage 2, we have a session hosted by Viasat, where their chairman and CEO, Mark Dankberg, is going to be giving a presentation on equitable access to finite NGSO resources and then taking questions and things based on that. So we do have those 2 showcases coming up. Following that, we'll have a break for 20 minutes or so, and then we come back for our second plenary session of the day, which is going to be looking at coverage from the sky and innovations within the aerospace and satellite sector. And as I said before, we're finishing up then with another Have Your Say session, so that'll be your chance to come and get involved in the discussions in that way there. So a busy day again, so we better get going, I guess. So without further ado, I would like to now welcome to the stage Stefan Sloan. Welcome, Stefan. Good to see you. And Stefan is going to be moderating this morning's first panel. So Stefan, looking forward to it. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and to those of you in the Americas, good morning, and in Europe, good afternoon, and elsewhere, good for you for joining us, and thanks for being here to discuss rural broadband And very appropriately, there's a lot of ground to cover, so we'll get right down to it here. We have a great panel of people here, and we'll start with Kirk Burgee, who is Chief of Staff for the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC. Good morning, Kirk.
Good morning, and good day to everyone else on the conference. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. As Stefan mentioned, I am the Chief of Staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC. I'm also a Deputy Director of the FCC's Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force and have been involved in the recent and upcoming auctions of universal service support. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about one of my other areas of focus, which is broadband data. And I'm going to start with broadband data because it is connected to everything else that we do, it seems. So just a little bit of background. The FCC collects broadband coverage data currently through the FCC Form 477, initiated in 2000, but began to collect broadband deployment data in 2013, at the time in the form of census blocks identified by the filers where they do or they can provide service. And that's what we currently collect on Form 477 in the way of deployment. When it was introduced, it was a big step forward. There was nothing really quite like it in terms of a nationwide compulsory reporting of deployment data, but the census block data had its limitations, particularly in terms of granularity. And so in 2019, the Commission, recognizing that issue, adopted a new collection, the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, that would introduce, it would be a separate collection from the Form 477. It introduced reporting in the form of geospatial coverage maps, with a crowdsourcing element for so where the data reported by the providers could be challenged, and what's known as a locations fabric, a broadband serviceable locations fabric, which would be a comprehensive database of all locations that could be connected to broadband. And the vision there was that the coverage data, the new coverage data, as challenged by outside stakeholders, would be overlaid onto the data fabric to provide a very granular picture of broadband deployment. Significantly, that digital opportunity data collection, as adopted in August of last year, would have been administered by the Universal Service Administrative Company, which currently administers our universal service programs. And would have been essentially the collection and the crowdsourcing elements would have been administered by USAC. Fast forward to March of this year, and Congress passed the Broadband Data Act, which largely affirmed what the Commission had done in August of last year in terms of the collection. It required the collection of broadband deployment data in the form of polygon shapefiles and on the wireless technologies propagation maps. Also allowed the use of collection in the form of lists of locations or lists of addresses where locations where broadband could be provided, but all of those would identify at a much higher level of granularity than the census block level. It also, the Broadband Data Act also introduced a required challenge process and a separate crowdsourcing process, as well as the locations fabric. Significantly, the Broadband Data Act provided that USAC could not have a role in the collection. And so that represented a fairly significant piece of the collection that was no longer available. The Broadband Data Act also established standards for collecting mobile data. They would be in the form of propagation maps for 4G LTE coverage, prescribed 4 megabits per second speed threshold with a cell edge probability of 90% and cell loading of 50%. So it's a very sort of specific in terms of the technical specifications by which the coverage would be reported on the mobile side. Similar for fixed wireless providers, except to the extent that the technology was materially different, warranting a different treatment. And then also there were a number of provisions in the Broadband Data Act calling for the collection of state and other mapping data and significant coordination with other stakeholders in terms of developing new broadband maps based on the improved collection formats. So that takes us to July of this year. In the FCC at that time adopted a second report and order and a further notice of proposed rulemaking, in which it adopted requirements for fixed reporting and mobile reporting that aligned with the requirements of the Broadband Data Act. They were largely, as I say, aligned in terms of the concepts, but the July order formally adopted that. Also established some specific requirements for fixed wireless providers, adopting specific technical specifications, and on the mobile side, adopting technical specifications for reporting. As required, the July order also adopted the broadband data fabric and established a number of processes for verifying the data that's submitted by the filers. It was also, in addition to an order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and the Commission sought comment on a number of additional issues relating to implementation of the new digital opportunity data collection, in particular speeds of fixed services, speed thresholds, and latency, collection of data concerning those for fixed services, propagation modeling standards for mobile services, on-the-ground testing for mobile, and also asked a number of questions about the new challenge process on both the fixed and the mobile side. So that was in July. Our record on the further notice closed a few weeks ago. We're currently reviewing that, and the next steps for us on the data side are to adopt additional rules that implement rules covering the additional elements on which comment was sought. We do not have funding to implement a number of the requirements, particularly the fabric platform and the collection platform and the challenge process platform. We're seeking to get funding for those, but until we do, we're not able to move forward significantly with the IT side and the platforms that would be necessary for the collection. So with that, I'll turn to our Universal Service Fund auctions, starting with the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction, which was completed in August of 2018. This is significant for a number of reasons. It was the first multi-round reverse descending clock auction of Universal Service support. It was significant also because it worked very well. Logistically, it went very well. The bidding took place over the period of about a month. Very few logistical problems. The framework that was adopted both pre-auction, during the auction, and post-auction seemed to work very well, and is either been adopted or proposed for other auctions, as I'll talk about a bit when I get to those. And the competition that occurred in the auction created a good value for the FCC in terms of the support money that was allocated. The estimated cost of serving the areas that were the subject of winning bids was substantially higher than what was actually allocated for those areas, and so it was viewed as a good value. Just an overview of the CAF2. The budget at the outset was $2.15 billion. Was a two-stage application process, and this is something that has been adopted or proposed for other auctions, where applicants come in as in a short form, a more abbreviated application process to get eligibility to bid for service in the auction, and then after the auction, the winning bidders submit long form applications, which provide a more detailed view of their financial and technical qualifications to get broadband funding. The CAF2 allowed differing technologies. It established you could bid at any one of 4 speed tiers and either of 2 latency levels. The speed tiers range from 10 megabits per second up to 1 gigabit per second. Weighting was applied to the higher latencies and the lower speed tiers, so that the weighting, it would be possible for an applicant proposing to offer a lower speed or a higher latency to compete equally with other applicants offering higher speeds and lower latencies the weighting would affect the amount of support that they received in the event that they won. It wouldn't determine who won the support. It would just determine how much support was available or was allocated as a result of it. Bidding, as I said, it concluded in August of 2018. There were 103 winning bidders. The 10-year support was $1.5 billion. 700,000 locations are covered by the winning bids in 45 states, and half of the winning bids went to providers committing to provide service of 100 megabits per second or higher. As I mentioned, it was possible to offer as low as 10 megabits per second in the CAF Phase 2 auction. We're nearly complete in awarding those funds and expect to have that process wrapped up in the near future. The auction winners are now, as they receive support, that commences a cycle of reporting and performance obligations. They're required to provide service to 40% of the locations within a state in which they won support by year 3. That goes up 20% every year until you get to 100% at year 6, after which they should be have reached their full performance. They're subject to reporting requirements along the way, as well as penalties and other implications of not meeting their milestones. Move now to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That is the next auction that will be taking place. In fact, is scheduled to begin bidding later this month on the 29th. It's a $20 billion budget, be allocated in 2 phases. The first phase being phase 1 that begins, as I said, on October 29th. It'll be up to $16 billion allocated over 10 years to high-cost areas that are identified as completely lacking service at 25.3 or higher. Phase 2 will be the budget will be the remainder of the $20 billion, and this will go to the partially served areas that were not included in the Phase 1, as well as other areas that were not awarded funding in Phase 1.
Kirk, let me pick up on these auctions, because we're in a moment here where auction design is being celebrated and Nobel Prizes are being handed out. And we have our own economist here as well. And I'd like to bring Shreyas Ravi into the discussion, please. He's with us from Economists Incorporated, and I think can give us a great perspective on where we are with development, auction planning, and design and construction. Shreyas.
Thanks, Stefan. So thanks, everyone. Really glad to be a part of this. This was a really important subject even before the pandemic. That's really been brought to the forefront, given how much people are relying on broadband to go to school, to do their jobs, to make doctor's appointments. Really honored to be a part of this, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Also, thank you to the Forum Global team. This conference has been great. Jordan, Dan, Kate, really been enjoying it so far, and one of the bright spots about it being virtual is that get to attend a conference with my dog for the first time. So that's exciting for both of us. So we can move to the next slide. So just a little background, I've worked in auctions for over 6 years, advised clients in spectrum auctions, as well as in universal service auctions. So I just want to talk about using auctions as an approach to solve this issue. Obviously, other countries are taking non-auction approaches. So I just want to talk about auctions as an approach and what the US has done. So first off, the costs to serve everyone are too high to arrive at that naturally. So if we don't do anything, it's not that we're eventually going to see all the rural areas covered with the speeds they need. We need another approach to do that, whether that's an auction or some other fund to fund service in these areas. I think the other thing we've seen, especially in the pandemic, is that low speeds don't cut it. People are relying on their broadband to do their jobs and to go to school, and they can't, be on a Zoom call with 20 other kids unless they have adequate coverage, adequate speed. So in auctions, there are a couple different ways that this problem is trying to be addressed. One is through spectrum auctions, and this has happened for a while, that a coverage obligation is attached to a spectrum auction. And this has been done in many different forums across most countries that have spectrum auctions. But unfortunately, we're not quite at the point where mobile broadband is a complete solution. And we see this with the stories during the pandemic where, families are deciding who, one kid is trying to go to school using the parent's cell phone plan, and that's not enough to cover, a job, or another kid going to school, or a doctor's appointment. So we're not there with mobile broadband, and thus we need an approach beyond that. So in the US, we've had these procurement auctions, which are unprecedented in their scale and their use. But it's worth pointing out that procurement auctions are the most common form of auction, have occurred forever. Any RFP you see is a procurement auction. You have different criteria, the budget being one of them. These auctions are not so different. The reason we need auctions for this is that it's a competitive industry. We can't take the same approach that the FCC took, 80 years ago with landlines, because we don't have a natural monopoly. Can't just set rates and have that natural monopoly figure it out. We need a way to incentivize service, given that it's a competitive industry. So you can move to the next slide. Okay, so now let's just talk about kind of the pros and cons of a procurement auction. So the first thing is that it's a large capital outflow. It's scary to put up, billions of dollars. The FCC's put up $20 billion for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund coming up. Secondly, you risk delaying planned deployments. So it's not that there's evidence that this has happened, but you have to be careful, say, scheduling an auction so far in advance that a firm that might deploy says, hey, why don't we wait for the auction so we can get subsidy with it. Similarly, you don't want to subsidize already planned or existing deployments. The point of these subsidies is to create new deployments and new build-outs. The last piece, it's really difficult to calculate the costs, and we saw this with the FCC CAF auction and the RDOF auction, all the work that went into the CAN model to determine the starting prices. That takes a tremendous amount of work. I mean, they're doing it down to the census block level. That being said, all of these constraints, they apply for any other mechanism too, whether it's an auction or it's a fund established to subsidize service. You're going to face all of these same issues. And with an auction, you have the advantage that it's a competitive process, and that competitive process hopefully will mitigate some of the risks. The other thing is that, if there is a time to deal with these risks, it's now. The risk of not providing these service to areas is much bigger than the risk of over-subsidizing. These are people that will be left without the ability to go to school and to do their jobs. It's tremendously important. So now, thinking about some of the benefits of an auction format, the first is that it's a lot easier to target specific areas and to affect specific coverage policy goals. The CAF and RDOF auctions are focused on census block groups. So these are just small groups of census blocks. It's the smallest areas I think ever used in an FCC auction. And that's much tougher to do if, say, a fund set up with some committee that has to figure this out on their own. It's much tougher to do that on a really detailed small scale. So the second related piece is that by having an auction, it allows the industry to determine the most efficient deployment, rather than have a regulator decide which deployment should fulfill that need. So we've seen that with CAF, just how successful that auction was with the number of applicants, not only the number of applicants, but the number of technologies and speeds and latencies represented across those. So by having that, it allows all of those different technologies and all those different firms to compete to the point where the firms that one support, at least theoretically, are the most efficient firms. The last piece is that it's a pretty, even though RDOF, CAF feel like really long processes, they're pretty quick for this sort of thing. The auction itself only takes a month, and to think that within a year or two this process goes from start to finish, at least in terms of assigning support, that's pretty remarkable for a huge government subsidy program. We can move to the last slide. Okay, so now just looking quickly at FCC CAF 2 auction. As Kirk said, it was tremendously successful. It assigned $1.5 billion over 10 years, 700,000 locations, 45 states. There are a few crucial parameters for this style auction, and that includes RDOF too. And we've seen that in the comments that followed CAF and the discussion preceding RDOF. One is just the prices. So the starting prices, of course, but the relative prices are especially important in this type of auction. Every product has a universal clock that decreases together until the budget's cleared, unlike an FCC forward clock auction. So those relative prices are even more important in this style auction. The second thing is the budget. Also, we've seen with RDOF that they've decided to split it up over phase 1 and phase 2. Basically, what that does is where you set the budget also has a say in the competition. So the lower the budget is relative to the total cost of initial areas, the more competition you'll see. And we saw a lot of competition in CAF. So the next thing also is performance, speed, latency weights. There was a lot of discussion about this between CAF and RDOF, right or wrong. The FCC moved towards higher weights for higher latency. The other piece, and the last piece of it, is the clearing rule, and this is where a big change happened between CAF and RDOF. In the CAF auction, basically the goal that was affected was to provide support for the maximum number of areas, but then given those areas to minimize the cost. So that means to allow a lower tier service over a higher tier one. In RDOF, that'll change, where the clearing rule is such that a higher speed firm gets priority over a lower speed one. So right or wrong, this was a policy goal that was affected in the clearing rule for RDOF. And that's something where you see in CAF, there's 1.98 billion budget, 1.49 was used. One question you might ask is it better to save that money, or is it better to use that money for higher speed service? So making no statements on that, but that's the type of question that was asked. So I'll wrap up now that I see Stefan on the screen. Just one parting note. It's really exciting to see auctions for this. We've seen 25 years of spectrum auctions, and we've seen how much those have changed. So we can always quibble about the details about these procurement auctions, but it's an amazing step by the commission to take it, and I hope that continues.
Sure, thank you. It's clear that the auctions have become very capable and very elegant tools for solving the issues here. But at the end of the day, in order to deploy what's allocated there, it is literally down in the dirt and doing the hard work. And so to speak somewhat to that, let's bring up Claude Aiken, who is the president and CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. Claude.
Thank you, Stefan, and it's great to be here today. Excited to be able to share some thoughts from our perspective at WISPA. Particularly, it's great to go after both Kirk and Shreyas, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to play off of that. So if we could go into the next slide, please, that would be fantastic. Since wireless ISPs or WISPs are somewhat newcomers, at least in the public policy space, I felt like it was a good opportunity here to give a little bit of background on who our members are. So a WISP is typically a really small company local company that provides high-speed broadband via a fixed wireless connection. I've put a few stats on the slide there that you can peruse, and I'm sure we can go into more discussion about this later. But I think one thing to highlight is just the relative size of the company. Even compared to some of the small rural telcos, these are really small companies by a factor of about 10 over what we would consider to be other small companies. So if we could go on to the next slide. These are small folks with a really, really big impact. And the reason for that is because fixed wireless broadband has been around for, it's been around for decades. And we're really excited to see some of the largest players in the wireless space adopting that approach and adopting that technology now. Because it's really a fast and cost-effective way to bring high-speed connectivity to rural America, and we've seen that particularly in the COVID area. With an example, like one of our members was able to, in a matter of days, stand up high-speed connectivity to COVID screening tents located in Missouri. These providers, WISPs, are typically the first terrestrial provider in a rural area. They may compete with satellite or maybe with DSL, and historically have gotten their start using unlicensed spectrum. So spectrum here in the U.S. in the 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz bands. But as they grow, getting into spectrum that has a little bit higher barrier entry to, which is licensed spectrum, usually first for backhaul and then for coverage and capacity. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Here's just a little bit of a case study of what we have seen from our perspective during COVID-19. We were really excited to see so many of our members stand up and stand out when it comes to free service, when it comes to the FCC's Keeping Americans Connected pledge, even just going above and beyond and providing things like special educational related connectivity to students at home while they were trying to conduct virtual learning early on in the pandemic. We also collected some interesting data, which you can see over there on the side. I think one of the interesting conversations that we see here in DC is, do we need fiber everywhere? Do we need symmetrical connectivity everywhere? And consumer data and consumer behavior seems to show that is not what consumers are doing with their connectivity, even when that consumer connectivity is undergoing even more usage than normal. So if we could go on to the next slide, that'd be great. Now, our members have been at this for a while. They've been innovating. They've been providing connectivity to areas that have typically been unserved or underserved for a long time. And there are a couple of things that have really enabled that to happen. One is smart spectrum policy. Unlicensed spectrum has been an incredible boon. We usually think of that for Wi-Fi. We think of that as the connectivity within the home, but the U.S.'s policy towards unlicensed spectrum has really allowed, in addition to that being used inside the home and inside the business, to be used to provide last mile connectivity to the home or to the business, which is a great reason why unlicensed spectrum should continue to be part of the mix of future spectrum policy. Subsidy policy, I think, as Kirk and Shreyas have talked a little bit about, that continues to be incredibly important to rural broadband. as well as infrastructure policy, right? So if you're talking a wireless connection, you need to be able to put that radio somewhere. So in order to be able to streamline access to infrastructure of height, a lot of our members will find ways around towers if that's a barrier, putting radios up on grain legs or water towers if that needs to be done. But ways that we can streamline infrastructure policy, it really does impact rural deployment. And then, because of the size of a lot of these companies that are on the front lines of serving rural America, taking account of small business when designing both regulatory mechanisms that are designed to corral the market in a certain direction, but also in distributing spectrum, in distributing subsidies, in ensuring access to infrastructure. That's kind of the overarching piece that ties all of this together. So if we go on to the next slide, that would be great. As Kirk and Shreyas kind of touched on, we've been seeing a paradigm shift in spectrum, and we think from our perspective at WISPA that this is a really good thing, that sharing spot markets, unlicensed, rather than the typical historical large area license, particularly as we go up higher and higher into the millimeter wave bands where the signal doesn't even travel that far. Auctioning off spectrum at PEAs doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, especially when the signal is going to be used in a very targeted fashion. Next slide, please. Subsidies are a similar story. You heard both Kirk and Shreyas talk a lot about CAF2 auction. We thought that was a really a great way to distribute subsidies, a departure from the old paradigm that was really positive. We're a little bit less excited about, as Shreyas mentioned, the clearing round in RDOF. We think that will end up meaning some more money is spent, but we're still excited to participate. Next slide, please. So with all of those four pillars that I mentioned, we know that the digital divide is stubborn, but with smart approaches to policy, our members and all the groups here on this panel, I think, are going to be really at the front lines of tackling it together. So thank you for the chance to talk, and look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Claude, thank you. And it's apparent that companies with small balance sheets are, in the aggregate, making a huge difference here. And we have another perspective, and it's a way to do it perhaps with a very large balance sheet. We have Jennifer A. Manor, who is making a number of contributions to this conference. But in this discussion, she will join us as chair of the Network and Services Working Group of ESOA. Jennifer, give us the view from the top.
So to speak. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me today. And let me tell you, as a satellite operator, this is actually an area that we really spend a lot of time thinking. It's not just good for business, but it also making sure we're solving the digital divide is good for public policy, and it's an area that we spend a lot of time on, both domestically here in the U.S. and internationally. So with that, maybe could you make the slides a little bigger, maybe? Thank you. And next slide. So when we get down to it, many areas of the United States, and I never can remember the latest number of people who are unserved, are 18 million or 15 million, but there's a significant number of users throughout the United States who are uncovered by terrestrial broadband. That's the same in the Americas, parts of the Amazon. You can think through tribal lands, very rural areas. And COVID was an area where I'm particularly excited, because I think the satellite industry, like the wireless industry, as Claude talked about, was really able to step in and provide a solution. I think the difference here was we were able to get services up in 2 to 3 days from a request. And this is where satellite's special. we get our satellites up into the sky. Once we have our cell tower in the sky or cell towers in the sky for the NGSOs, we're able to provide service. So what we did see was a significant increase in demand for the service, whether it was my company, Hughes, or Viasat, another one of our member companies who are the big broadband providers in the US, or other of our members around the globe. We were able to get service up very, very quickly in 2 to 3 days. So there wasn't a lag time, and that was important. I do believe that a number of those folks who adopted during the pandemic will continue to use service. I think that's something that we all need to work together on to ensure that that service stays up, and that's really why, in some ways, I do believe that the subsidization is important, but even with subsidization, you still have an adoption issue. But we do expect to see, for the long term, that there's going to be more suburban rural usage than we've seen in the past, and there's going to be a need for multiple solutions. I have a picture here, or pictures, I should say, that I'm particularly excited about because it just shows you a few things that we're doing in the Americas as an industry, whether it's backhaul today, which we're providing for 4G. I expect we'll be providing it for 5G very shortly. One of the areas that's been really successful throughout the Americas, including in the United States, is community Wi-Fi. And it's particularly good in areas where people have less economic means because they're able to get access at a very low rate to Wi-Fi that they need. And then, of course, direct-to-consumer broadband. Throughout the U.S. today, we have places we go as high as 100 megs. That'll continue to be increasingly available in the United States, especially with the launch of Hughes satellite, Jupiter 3 very shortly, and as Viasat ends, more satellites as well. And then, of course, essential mobile services. So next slide, please. This is my picture of, just to give you an idea of where we fit in. And this isn't just for broadband, this is for 5G, and I'll talk about that. But one of the things, there was a mention about whether we have specific speeds. The speed's up to 100 megabit. We are pretty good right now. We have a lot of capacity. We've really worked on that. With the NGSOs, we start to address some of the latency concerns. Though I do want to note that most traffic that users, consumers in particular, use is not latency sensitive. It's really things like video, high-speed video games. It's not what you're using for teleeducation, telework, telehealth, e-government. And then, of course, there's the resiliency. I really watched in awe. I'm sure all of you saw in the news last night. Virginia had a fiber cut, and they couldn't actually go forward. It was the last day for voters to register to vote, and so there was an accident, and someone cut a fiber. I imagine this was an important line, so there was path diversity, but path diversity wasn't true path diversity. They probably had two cables, maybe AT&T and Verizon, to the elections headquarters. But what in essence happened, you cut a fiber, you lose both. So whether you have a satellite backup or some other, then you would have that resiliency. So really you'll see we provide this service not just to farms, homes, hospitals, first responders, but also on airplanes. As many of you may remember pre-pandemic, when you were flying and you used to curse because you actually could get your internet on board, or maybe you liked it, trains and ships. So really extending the reach of terrestrial 5G networks and broadband everywhere. So next slide, please. So in terms of connecting the US, as I talked about, we have speeds of 25.3 to 100 megabits. It'll be 100 megabits across CONUS in the next year or so. We have coverage throughout much of Latin America. I'm really excited too about the NGSO systems, whether it's OneWeb or anyone else, SpaceX, Amazon. They're going to bring additional capacity and additional benefits to folks wherever they are, including in the more northern regions of the world. As I said, we provide service direct to consumers, Y-spots, and I keep going back to the time to deploy, because I really do think the fact that you can get service to people in a couple of days as opposed to years really matters. So one of the things, and I was really interested in the previous speakers talking about the auctions, I too think that CAF and RDOF are exciting, but what we've seen throughout this process is I'd say non-technology neutral regulations. For instance, the RDOF has right now a preference for fiber, as Claude was talking about. I'm not sure that makes sense. You certainly limit the amount of places money can do, and I'm not sure that's necessarily the right approach. So I would say regulators around the world really need to look at technology neutral regulations and funding opportunities to ensure that all technologies, whether it's the folks that Claude introduces, represents, whether it's satellite, whether it's fiber, or any other solution. Next slide. So just to conclude, satellite's a key to bridging the divide. We can get connectivity out to people on a really quick, cost-effective basis. We have proven capability. We're out there today. Instance in the US today, there's satellite broadband users over 2 million throughout the US, much more when you look at it globally. We're part of the ongoing work in 3GPP. ASOA particularly is a representative there, and we've been very active at making sure we're going to be included in Release 17, which is coming up. And satellite broadband not only enables rural broadband, but it also provides service for public safety, disaster relief. And during the pandemic, we were there and we were up and operational very quickly. So like the WISPs that Claude talked about, we really need spectrum availability, just like the other operators, whether it's T-Mobile who's talking after me or the WISP or anyone else, and we need technology neutral regulation. So we're really excited to be part of bridging the digital divide and do see it as an important part of our mandate. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really liked your slide about where you fit in, because it looked like it was absolutely everywhere, and that was well done. We have a chance now to come back to the U.S. and discuss with one of the prime carriers. We have with us Chris Weiserick, who is Senior Director of Spectrum Policy with T-Mobile USA. That it would be the Un-carrier or the Magenta machine that is out there upgrading more than 100 sites a day. And Chris, when you reach over 250 million pops, I suppose some of those folks are in rural areas.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be with back at this conference. I think they're roughly the same topic as we had last year. I covered on rural broadband is really critical, and this year I get to come up and say we have over 3/4 of the country thereabouts, so the U.S. population at least covered with 5G rural broadband services. We're very excited to have the iPhone 12 out now, being launched in the next couple weeks. It will have 5G. It will have 5G that works, unlike Verizon 5G, which will maybe work someday if you're directly in front of a cell site that's in the middle of a coffee shop in downtown Washington, D.C. or New York, or whatever. But with T-Mobile, you have 5G can actually work when you can leave being tethered in front of a device. We're very grateful, though, to be here on this panel today and talk about our rural broadband deployment. It's been a big issue. We've worked in the Government Affairs Office at Broadband, trying to help policymakers find ways to bring broadband to rural America. And we've also made very significant commitments, covering 99% of the population with 5G in 6 years, and I think 90% of the rural population as well, along with providing certain in-home broadband issues. As Claude mentioned in the WISP world, that they're seeing some of the big carriers, and we're the big carrier, who's really making a big commitment to providing rural broadband via wireless connectivity. So very happy to be doing that. One of the things I wanted to talk about, though, is tribal issues, because this is part of the panel, and I really wanted to drive home this issue because it's been becoming more and more of an issue for some of this, disconnected communities. That's really, if you were to look at communities that are rural, but generally have rural and have lack of connectivity, the tribal Native nations in the U.S. Really is a good example of folks who, at a systematic level, or at a very large level, are sometimes lacking in issue connectivity. If we could take a look, maybe the first slide, Dan, if you could pull that up for me. In the United States, just as a quick primer for folks who are outside the U.S., in the United States, we have a number of Native nation lands or tribal lands, Indian tribal reservation lands, that have a very long, drawn-out history in American history. but there's some 334 thereabouts. Yeah, question me on some of the exact numbers on the lands throughout the U.S., but most of them are what we call west of the Mississippi River, western part of the U.S., but some of them take a very, very large parcels of land, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of land, measured in tens of thousands of square miles. A good chunk of like the state of Oklahoma, for instance, is tribal lands. And these areas sometimes don't really have very good connectivity. The American U.S. West part of the U.S. West side, it doesn't have great connectivity as a whole. And this is an area where T-Mobile has been looking at and we're trying to address our coverage issues. And there's a variety of factors that go into the tribal land issue coverage issues, and they are also pervasive or dealing with in for rural area coverage. So we are looking at how to deal with some of these tribal issues. And so one of the big things with our rural broadband commitments is bringing rural broadband to rural America, and it covers these tribal lands as well. So if, Dan, you can bring up slide number 2 for me. And it shows, this is our public facing, when we submitted our merger and part of our T-Mobile Sprint merger, what kind of coverage we're going to provide in 6 years. You can see we're going to cover a large amount of the tribal land. So we're not going to cover all the tribal land and have perfect coverage, but we're going to have a lot of it. And it's really important for us to be able to hit these kind of milestones. One of the things that's very fascinating for rural coverage, and it was mentioned here a little while ago, is it's not just the fact that there's low population density. There are places where you have low population density. You could look in the United States, the state of Nebraska, for instance, is a relatively low population, big area. But the challenge there for coverage is not so much population but it's when you have a flat terrain and you have a lot of geography, it's much easier to cover those parts of the country. When you go to areas that have lots of topography and the morphology is not very conducive for signal penetration, you get a lot of more challenges, and especially you get a lot more odd coverage holes. So I dealt recently with some folks in the mountains of North Carolina and the Asheville, North Carolina area, if anyone's familiar with that. It's a relatively large city in western North Carolina, but you'll see lots of areas in that particular part of the country where you'll have great signal on one side of the mountain, but if you go over a hill, you have no signal, and it's not because the cell site's pretty far away. As a crow flies, it's probably measured in 3 or 4 kilometers. But once you get behind a hunk of mountain, you're just not going to have any signal. So that kind of challenging coverage area, it's just the solutions there are very, very limited, and a lot of it has to do with siting policy and the willingness of localities and municipalities or tribal lands, the tribal authorities, to provide additional sites out there. So you have to provide siting on top of a mountain, or siting at a better location, has better line of sight to every place. You have to have the tower there, you have to have the electricity there, you have to have the fiber backhaul to get there. And wireless carriers, we do some of that, but really at the end of the day, it's going to be a tower company, and then providing the tower and the infrastructure, and the power company and a landline provider who will provide a fiber backhaul connection. And all that comes out to do with, as well, the entities who own the land or control land or permitting willing to tolerate that. Everybody wants high-speed broadband, but nobody wants to have a giant tower on top of their majestic mountain interviewing the sunset from their front yard or backyard porch. So you have mutually needing and exclusive desires, and so reconciling that is a great deal of challenge. So those are issues I think coming from rural broadband, and I think we have some questions and we'll tee it up for discussion here later on. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Chris. And that fits actually perfectly there. You touched on siting issues, and some of them technical and regulatory, others sort of aesthetic. I think that fits in very nicely with the question that was brought up, and I believe the poll will be on your screen if it isn't already, about what's the biggest challenge, what's the biggest thing holding back the extension of 5G coverage. It appears that amongst our respondents, the spectrum and the licensing frameworks and the backhaul are not significant. But Chris, as you said, the cost and the length of site acquisition and the upgrade process is significant. And by a majority, the biggest issue is the business case. So let me open it up to you panelists here. We have a number of different perspectives from space, from the terrestrial, and from the licensed and unlicensed worlds. Please have your say on your view on what the challenges are for the business case. All right, that wasn't fair. I should have asked someone to go first. Claude, you probably have a constituency with a very broad range of business cases. Would you share those?
We do, and I think it all kind of bears remembering. Like, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about 5G? Are we talking about the 5G NR spec? Are we talking about some of the other technical innovations that get lumped in with that? I think I would agree. Business case is clear, but I think it's also good to remember that we're very early on in the 5G equipment life cycle. A lot of the gear that is out there right now is very new, very expensive, and we're not even at the point of bending the cost curve yet on equipment, which is why you see a lot of providers still using 4G LTE because the cost there is a lot lower. The performance, at least as far as what consumers are demanding, is still very much there. So I think it'll be a while before 5G makes it to rural, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because 4G LTE is still fantastic, and some of the other innovations such as beamforming, beam steering, MU-MIMO, those are making their way into radios now, that while they may not be the narrow 5G spec, you're still having continual performance improvements. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think it's going to be a while, and I think the cost curve has to bend a little bit more before we can truly see that kind of equipment deployed in rural.
Thank you, Claude. And Jennifer, I think maybe you have one of the most interesting group of business models there, ranging from IoT and other processes. Please, what's your perspective?
So thank you so much. And like my fellow panelists, I have a dog here, and you never know when he barks, so I'm always on mute. So I apologize about that. But so I think satellite's unique as a non-terrestrial technology. We're covering service areas. So as long as you're within our coverage, it doesn't change the cost structure for us on providing service. So we're out there, and that's why as I mentioned, during the pandemic, we were in a very special position, I believe, to bring service to customers, new customers who needed access on a very short time basis, because we didn't have to build out the towers, we didn't have to deal with site location. I mean, we have some ground equipment. My company, I think we have about 50 gateways throughout the United States. That's our ground equipment. So we don't have that. And that's not a big impact on our business case. We're up and we're able to take on customers. So that's where I think satellite is particularly attractive for rural areas. But also, I don't want to say we don't provide service in areas, for instance, things people don't think about today. This is kind of just an example. My company, 84% of credit cards swiped at gas stations, the data is carried through our system. And of course, whether you're in Chicago or in out in Asheville, North Carolina, which I don't really consider that rural, but that's something that's there, right? So you have this nice interplay where we can provide service where it's needed, urban, rural, but particularly for rural, we don't have the time lag that you do see with the other technologies. So thank you.
Certainly. And let me bring back in Kurt and Shreyas on this, because certainly there is an acknowledgement of the business case in the design of auctions and in the planning for allocating out spectrum. would you comment on, and I appreciate that the RDOF process is undergoing and that there are appropriate boundaries for us there, but Kirk, what is there that you see in that process that contributes to each of the business plans that we see with Claude, Jennifer, and Chris?
Well, it's been touched on already, but I think it's the design of the auctions are geared towards providing flexibility, allowing the market to make decisions about what service makes sense where, and I think that's been one of the big successes of the approach that has been taken at least in the CAF2 and also with the RDOF. Have not looked at the breakdown, but I think we had a very diverse set of bidders in the CAF phase 2. I would expect to see that.
And Shreyas, is there a comment that you can make about when you consult clients? I would think that the business case is right up at the front there of their objectives and them expressing to you their ability to participate in the strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not an engineer, so I don't want to talk about the technology side of it. But as Kirk said, the business case, differing business cases, that's exactly what an auction's about. This allows us to put up a subsidy and allows different firms, different technologies to arrive at the most efficient solution. One other thing that's worth saying, just frame this question a little bit differently. If I asked, why does the Amtrak from Boston to DC take 6 hours? We could have a list of things like, the topography, the population density. We could come up with all these different reasons why it's really expensive and really difficult. But the number one thing is that we don't have a cohesive infrastructure plan that deals with it all together. There are those individual issues, but I see that similarly here, where we can talk about, the specific technology issues in serving rural areas that are underserved, but with the correct investment and the correct auction design, we can arrive at that naturally.
So there's a silo issue here, is there? Jennifer.
Thank you. So I wanted to respond to Kirk, and Kirk and I've had many discussions about this, and I don't think that we're not at a business case driven universal service policy with the auctions. I think the auctions are a very efficient mechanism for awarding universal service. We fought for years until CAF satellite wasn't even included. I don't know when things like Wi-Fi and Spectrum, other things besides fiber were included, but we certainly weren't included. And what we saw in CAF was a fairly large performance penalties for non-fiber technologies. And I think it went even worse with RDOF, to be honest, in that now you've got basically a preference for fiber. So if you meet the reserve price, once the reserve price is met, fiber wins. It doesn't matter that perhaps satellite or wireless or something else can bring the service at a more reasonable price. So this is where I have my biggest concerns, and I think from a satellite industry perspective, we have our biggest concerns here. There's what I would say are subjective determinations made by the FCC that change this auction into something that's less than what I think could be ideal. I think there's going to be members of America, consumers across the United States who aren't able to get broadband through the universal service funding programs of the FCC because the money has been decided that it'll be spent on perhaps a more expensive technology than a wireless technology, whether it's satellite or Wi-Fi or wireless. And sorry if I'm butchering, Claude, what you call yourself. So I apologize. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think here we're all sort of around an issue of how you view 5G. Is it a network of networks? Is it a bunch of things that contribute to or is it a series of silos? And Chris, I think you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, so one of the challenging things I think we have in the US that a lot of our friends overseas, whether it's in Europe or Latin America, and maybe sort of in Asia, we have a degree of what's called federalism. We have all this different government, and I was thinking of the Amtrak example of going from DC to Boston onto the train, and an infinite amount of money, Donald Trump money is not going to get the train built because you have to cross 5 or 7 different states. You have all the state issues, but then you also have something called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a regulatory body that is combined of the state, and then you have a city that you have to deal with, and the city has its own perspectives, and in the U.S. we have these federalism issues, and it's a great deal of challenge. If you ask someone in Salisbury, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, they would really like to get additional broadband and get additional sites and towers and stuff. But if you go to Berkeley, California, they don't want broadband. They don't want sugary sodas. They don't want handsets. They don't want anything. And it's challenging when you have these different jurisdictions, and they will fight you sometimes, and other times they'll not fight you, and then have overlay. So silos, and it's one of the unique things about America. We have a lot of self-government options, and it can be very, very challenging. And regardless of how much money you have and the business case on it, nothing is effective, or nothing can fight City Hall sometimes. So
you're speaking to my heart, having done site acquisition work, where the least considered thing became the most important one in order to get the tower up, and a lot of times that has to do with people understanding incentives, and that's very easy to misunderstand. On that topic of incentives, I think well, Claude, let's talk about how wireless and wired work together and accomplish the goals for the end user.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's kind of as Jennifer was touching on, we're seeing a preference in the procurement auction, the subsidy auction format for fiber, and I think the challenge from our perspective is, if you only include fiber in your diet, you don't have a very complete diet. You may experience some digestive issues if you go that route, and so I think what we're trying to get at is you're trying to get to an approximation of letting the market work, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we may have taken a little bit of a step back from our perspective with the way RDOF works, but I think if we're talking also about spectrum, we look at the CBRS framework with the user share. That's what I kind of meant when we're talking about innovative spectrum approaches, where we don't have. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at with my presentation. We're moving from a legacy model, more of a command and control model, to more of a market control, real-time model, both for spectrum and for subsidies. And I think we should continue that progress as opposed to moving backwards.
Claude, I understand that, and I think I see a parallel also, remembering back to the onset of COVID, where there was this flood of wireless internet service providers coming to tower companies needing siting. And they were small companies with small balance sheets. And with the largest tower companies, there wasn't an immediate fit there. And perhaps there's a parallel for that in spectrum. Jennifer, let me bring the conversation back to you here, because I think you can complement what Claude has said here.
Yeah, actually, I liked his fiber analogy, but I think that's true. I think there's, I would never tell you that satellite solves every problem. It doesn't. It's certainly not going to give you, it's certainly not the best solution, perhaps in certain areas, or there's other solutions that are equally good, and we may be a part of a solution. But I think what our vision is, and that was really the picture that you like, Stephen, was really showing it's a network of networks. You're not just looking at satellite, and I think 3GPP has recognized that in the standards for 5G. When we started working 3GPP, some of the members were a little hostile, and it took some time, and now we actually have folks there's an association whose name I'm forgetting, MTMN, I think, but I'm terrible with acronyms, which is a group of wireless operators who really do see us as an important complement, whether it's backhaul, whether it's providing service in rural areas, whether it's providing IoT. We all are different parts, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's T-Mobile cellular service, it's service, whether it's fiber, and I think the market has to kind of let that go back and forth to figure out who's the best provider, who's the most efficient provider to provide this part of the service. And that's where I get nervous with what the FCC has done and what some other regulators are considering on things like subsidies, because the government's making choices. And I will say, and I've been at the FCC 3 times, regulators shouldn't be picking technologies. And I'll give you a good example. When we were deciding what to do with 911, E911 for mobile carriers, this was actually a success. We chose not to take that technology for location accuracy and let the market decide. And that was one where you've seen this incredibly robust market that's grown out because we put in a simple requirement, but let the operators and the equipment vendors really decide what the best choice is. And that's my concern with what I'm seeing when it comes to subsidies, is that the government is deciding this is the choice. So thank you.
Okay, well, point well taken. And there are some things that the government does get to decide, and it's important that we have their leadership there. We're focused here and we're speaking about rural areas. And when I think about spectrum in rural areas, 600 megahertz is what immediately comes to my mind. And I think there's a great success story there from the incentive auction. Let's look forward now. And I'll start with you, Kirk, but with Shreyas as well. I'm still here. I hope I'm still here. What spectrum and what planning you see ahead for rural markets, building off the success in 600?
Well, I think I defer to.
I have your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'd defer to Shreyas on that one. I mean, I could speak to the 5G fund and what's looked at there. That's the next of the major support auctions. The chairman has circulated a report and order that would lay out the framework for that auction. It's going to be considered later this month at the commission meeting, and it establishes a lot of the parameters around that. I think that there's the constraints surrounding who can bid in that are not completely defined at this point, but there is a requirement to have exclusive access to licensed spectrum, and so there's some limiting there. But I think we'll just have to see, what is ultimately adopted and what there's some further issues that need to be worked out even after the report and order is considered. So more to come on that front.
Yeah, I don't think I have strong opinions there. Look forward to discussing it, next year after some time's gone by with the 5G fund. But curious to hear what other panelists coming from different technology backgrounds have to say about that.
Yeah, yes, Chris. Then certainly this is something you can speak to.
Yeah, T-Mobile is going to do it. We're doing it with 600. We're doing a 2.5 gigahertz midband. We want to do more of it with hopefully have a 2.5 gigahertz white space auction, which covers a lot of rural America. So we're going to do it. We're doing it now. It's expanding as the day goes by. And rural America 5G is only available today in the United States, and it's in a 5G network.
And Claude, is there an unlicensed complement to the 600 megahertz licensed spectrum?
So I think the answer is, from the WISP perspective, it's multiple tools in the toolbox, right? So whatever is the best tool for the job is what folks will use. I think the unlicensed complement is TV white spaces. That's been kind of developed here in the U.S. in fits and starts. We're appreciative that the FCC is continuing to move forward on that, but I think we still have a little bit of a ways to go before that is more useful for rural, just because of some of the regulatory barriers that folks see using it.
Understood. And I've been trying to incorporate the questions that have been coming from our audience in our discussion here, but let me put up a couple of jump balls here for for our panels to answer. We have a question about, are procurement auctions a U.S. only phenomena, or are other countries also considering that sort of approach? This is beyond my experience. Whom among us here can speak to this?
So I think the big issue is that countries are really unwilling to put up the money the way the U.S. has. So I don't really know of other concrete examples where countries have taken it as far as the U.S. has. But that's the big issue. It's scary to put up billions of dollars. I don't think it should be. This is really important, but that's how it is.
We should all have the benefit of the persistent bidder in the market, shouldn't we? Thank you, Shreeyas. We also have a question here. If the business case is the huge issue for 5G in the USA, how do we see development in South America? The questioner is saying it seems we're going to have 4G LTE for a while. Who has a South American perspective for us, or an opinion there that you can share? Yes, Jennifer.
And just to compliment, just to go back on the procurement issue, we're quite active in the Americas. And a lot of what's been done is that it's done through government procurement to get up service areas. So they'll do a procurement for Wi-Fi or for schools or hospitals. So I agree with what you say. I'm not sure that there's the same amounts of money that are available. In terms of Latin America 5G, well, the good news, satellite's there, and satellite operators are providing broadband service today in the most rural areas. And there's certainly, I don't want to go too much out of SOA's expertise, but there's certainly spectrum auctions and other things going forward. But satellite is an important part in Latin America. And for instance, our company's seen our customer base. We've been active in Latin America, I want to say, on our own since I'd say 2017 has grown, significantly. And we saw the same sorts of growth with regards to the pandemic, including, of course, in the rural areas.
Then I'll put up another open question here. An important element of 5G, as I have discussed it and experienced it, is the Internet of Things. And things don't cease to exist when they leave urban areas. As a matter of fact, it can be as important or more important to be able to have that data from rural areas. And I don't have a sense of just how demanding the things are on networks. Maybe Claude and Jennifer and Chris would just take a very quick run at the experiences and or the planning that you're doing for non-people traffic.
One thing I can talk about is UAS, aerials, drones. Those are big things, very important. People like to see them. People want them to fly everywhere. They can be very latency sensitive. So satellite is probably not the best solution for that, especially, not fixed geo stuff. Maybe LEO stuff will be able to do it. But when you need to keep the milliseconds down to 10s and 20s, it's just you have to have the right network, and a 5G terrestrial network is good for that. And hopefully the T-Mobile 5G terrestrial network is really a good solution for that.
So I'll jump in there and say that while I'm classically trained as a lawyer, so I'll give a lawyer answer. It depends. So if you're talking, a video feed from a calving barn, that's probably a more high bandwidth application that you're talking about. UAS, it's more latency sensitive. If you're tracking a number of different vehicles or across a large farmland, you're probably, you need GPS access. It's lower speed. Latency doesn't matter quite as much, but it depends on the application. But having that connectivity out there is absolutely critical.
And just to add, I agree. Since Claude and I went to the same law school, I of course agree with his classical training, though he may have got a couple of years after me. But I would say yes, it really does depend. Satellite's been providing IoT for years. Especially whether it's narrowband non-latency. There's a huge amount of narrowband, non-latency sensitive traffic that MSS systems can cover, FSS. But you've also got, I agree with Chris, there's going to be more latency sensitive traffic. The LEOs will be able to do that. So I do think, but I would go back to the network of networks approach that we talked about. Probably not one of our technologies is the right one for it. It's a combination. And I think that's the beauty of 5G and the beauty of how the digital divide is going to be solved is as technologies increase, as the standards allow us better interoperability, it's going to be transparent to the end user. And that's really what you want. It's going to be, how do we get it there? What's the best approach? What's the most efficient from a cost, spectrum, and other bases? And then you're going to package that and deliver that to the end user. So I think we're in a really exciting time to try and solve this very important issue of the digital divide.
It is always the case, isn't it, that big problems always have a solution set which contains and all of the participants. Well, thank you all for these very poignant insights and direction on what unfortunately continues to be a challenging problem, but one that is bringing up some excellent solutions. Thank you, Kirk and Shreyas and Claude and Jennifer and Chris. Do so appreciate your comments.
And one more thank you, Stefan, as well. So fantastic panel. Thank you all very much. That really was interesting and a discussion that I'm sure we could have continued for a lot longer, but unfortunately we do have a lot to fit in. So we did have to wrap that up. But thank you all. That really was an excellent discussion. So really appreciate all your time and all your thoughts with that. And thank you again to everybody out there. I know there were quite a few questions. I think we got through most of the questions that were asked then, but thank you again for all of your key thoughts, questions, and for getting involved in the discussion there as well. So again, that's really appreciated. So next up, we are now moving on to our next wave of showcase sessions. So if I can bring that up here. So yes, we now have our next showcase sessions. So starting very shortly on our 2 showcase stages, we have 2 sessions. So on showcase stage 1, hosted by LYA, we have a session that's looking at the US CBRS auction and giving a perspective on the value of shared licenses in that prime 5G band. And that's with LYA co-presidents Joanne LeMay and Rob Yates. And on showcase stage 2, we have a presentation being made by Mark Dankberg, who's chairman and CEO of Viasat. So Mark is going to be presenting on equitable access to finite NGSO resources, spectrum and orbits, and he's also going to be taking questions afterwards at the end of that presentation as well. So those sessions are about to start in just a couple of minutes over on our showcase stages, so please do make your way over there now. Following that, we have a short break, and then we're back here on the main stage at 11:40 DC time for our next plenary session, which is looking at coverage from the sky and innovations within the aerospace and satellite sector. Thank you once again to Stefan. Thank you once again to all our panelists. Thank you to you guys out there as well. And as I said, look forward to seeing you in the showcase sessions shortly, and then back here at 11:40 for our next plenary session. Thanks, everyone, and see you shortly.